Welcome, one and all, to the greatest and undisputed best podcast in existence.
Wow,
Deep Fat.
We're on Chapo Trap House now. We're on Chapo Trap House, TJ.
Yeah,
we're
dude.
on the Joe Rogan Experience. I didn't realize where's
Dude,
Joe.
we're the
Undisputed best.
We're the fucking Chapo Trap House.
Chapo
Joe
Trap
Rogan
House
Experience.
is
We're better than all that. Why are you trying to
us?
sell us like that mainstream bullshit? You know
Joe
what we are,
Rogan,
TJ?
more like
Underground.
Grove slogan. We are the fucking real shit.
Wow, dude, I'm quoting that, and the next time you go on a show, I'm spamming his social media with that clip.
Oh, yeah, bitch. Joe Rogan ain't shit. Chapo Trap House ain't shit. Every other podcast in existence ain't shit. Motherfuckers.
Well, you got to pick fights right at the beginning.
I ain't
of an
picking
episode.
no fight. There ain't no fight. I can't. If I go step on an anthill, is that picking a fight? No. That's
Yes,
showing
you're
my
picking a fight with the
godlike
ants.
supremacy to those fucking ants.
Those ants might crawl up your foot and bite your ass, and then there's a war on.
Paul, listen up. That's what I say to that bitch.
A stunning reputation.
Wow, dude, you poo-pooed me better than I poo-pooed you, so I can see
agree.
the point.
I agree. I am better. That's right.
Pish
Good
posh.
point, Paul.
Pish posh. Don't compound your victory by
All right,
wallowing
so
in your
before
victory.
we get too far into Jeffrey Dahmer, I want you guys to see what Paul talks about behind the scenes.
What?
This is Paul.
You recorded me without my knowledge?
Yes, championing the genocide of the dumb people.
Wow, dude.
Let's kill off people that are like demonstrably hurting the planet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Get the dumbs. No racial bias across the board. Just, we'll even come up with a regional thing. We'll be like, look, if you live in an area where there's no actual education, then we can't accept, come up with a good test. But once we found that test,
There you go. There you have it, ladies
Once
and
we come up
gentlemen.
with that test.
look, this is, you guys have heard of deep fake technology. You're seeing a prime example of deep fake technology here. I never made that statement. It's a carefully crafted hoax by TJ Kirk and his brother, who were obviously in cahoots with one another.
We pressured.
May I point to the numerous instances, Paul, of you making similar statements
Yeah.
and ideologies?
I don't remember
On
any of
this
these
show,
instances,
Paul?
sir. I don't have any
How
recollection.
dare you impugn the honor of these people, Paul?
I don't
To
recall.
present them false
What was
information.
that? There's a comic by Cyanide Happiness that kind of makes the same point.
Oh, is there? What was the point?
Come on, people. Kill
about
the dumbs.
Kill the dumbs.
Kill the dumbs, dude.
Yeah.
We gotta kill the dumbs.
Man, that is a great. I mean, there's not a great context for that kind of talk. I'll admit, I'm a little wild, but like that was just kind of shows you the power of pulling somebody's statement totally out of context.
Yeah, I mean, there was
Because that conversation had bookends that led to that. You know what I mean?
No.
That wasn't just something that I plopped down in my chair before the show and was like, "Kill all dumb people." All right, let's go.
I don't know. That's kind of how I
Dude,
remember
we
it.
just got to advocate like the Thanos approach. Just like,
go.
look, let's find a way to dispassionately kill half the population.
That's not what I want. Check this out. So this is the sign on happy. Wow, reading these YouTube comments, it's full of retards. Yeah, to be honest, I think Hitler had the right idea. And the other guy's like, what? Just the wrong demographic. Yeah, true.
Yeah, I guess.
I think that's how it goes. YouTube commenters need to be killed, man. I would kill the YouTube commenters.
I don't think I would. I feed on their negative energy.
You think it's too much of a fuel?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like the fire under my ass a lot of the times, and I think they know it too. That's why there's so many of them hanging around.
See, I just want them all dead. I'm okay with them just dying. Because you know what? I figure like a lot of people watch my videos. Most people do me the service of never commenting. Those who do comment, I have no problem with them dying.
What if their comment is positive?
Well, yeah, what if they're like, TJ, you're fucking the
I mean,
greatest?
obviously not them.
Oh, obviously
no, the
not
ass
them.
kissers can stay. I'm
But
talking.
they're commenters,
So,
TJ.
I'm
What
ta-
if they're
So
comment?
TJ's a true dictator.
Yeah.
You can support TJ if you're positive about
Yeah,
what
it's
TJ's
okay
doing.
to support me.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
But if you're talking shit,
As long as you have something nice to say about Fidel have something nice for you.
exactly. Is that what fairer deal are you gonna get than that? Huh?
What a great deal, dude.
Yeah.
I don't
What a
think
great
there is
deal.
one.
I don't think there's a fairer deal than that one.
If you just praise me in everything I do, we're good.
So tonight's episode is about serial killers.
Well,
It's about
serial
a serial
killer.
killer.
Singular, TJ.
And I got to tell you,
It's about Jeffrey Dahmer, right?
yep, Jeffrey Dahmer. And as is the case with a lot of our biographical episodes, when we sit down to research them, we end up finding out that the common story is a little bit bullshit.
Right.
And this is no different.
Yeah.
I wanted
so
to
it's
kind
not
of
like it's not really just even a passage of time thing. It's just like this stuff is immediately mythologized.
right, and at every level too, and we'll talk about that as we go.
Well-
But I wanted to structure this episode like a pretty informational episode. I wanted to start with his childhood, go to his teen years, go to the era where he was killing, and talk about his murders, and then talk about the media sensation behind it,
Right.
the movies and
Well,
the books.
I guess the first question I would have is if you immediately, like you guys have said, you immediately mythologize something, then it's kind of really hard to know or to kind of discern any truth from that, isn't it? I mean,
Well, I didn't think it was going to be. When I set out to find out, like, let's find out some stuff about what he was like as a kid, I thought I was going to find a bunch of pretty easy stuff. And what I found was a bunch of contradictory stuff and a bunch of implicative stuff pointing the finger at the parents or saying the parents were blameless.
a lot
There
of
seemed to be an
salacious
agenda
commentary, yeah.
behind it, but no real. And so I went looking for that, somebody that knew him as a child, and I found that his father, Lionel Dahmer, wrote a book called The Father's Story. And then I think, TJ, there's
I
a
have it right
picture
here.
of the cover of that. It's a pretty big picture.
A father's story you see here. This is a young Jeffrey Dahmer as a kid.
Yep.
His dad sitting there by the bank watching over him. Lionel Dahmer, that's his dad's name.
And so I thought to myself, I was like, well, and I could find quotes from this book. A lot of these, publications and websites, even Wikipedia is guilty of this. Used a quote lifted completely out of context, just like TJ did at the beginning of this episode.
That's why I did it.
And I was like, fuck it, I'll just buy this book real quick. I looked at it, it was 250 pages. I was like, fuck it, I'll get it. For the research for this.
Right. But you couldn't.
But I couldn't because this book is out of print.
Yeah, it's out of print. Here's a later edition of this book. You see that if you want to buy it, you can't buy it. There's no hardcovers even available. If you want to buy it in good to acceptable condition, it's $51. So it's out of print. You could still you can still buy copies that were previous in circulation, but there's no new copies being printed. It's
At
not.
all.
It's being if you buy it on Amazon, you're buying a used copy.
There's
for
no ebook. There's
$50 to $200.
You know what I mean? It's just not really being sold anywhere. And so
it was published in what, the 90s?
I think for the first time, it was published while he was still alive and in prison by his father. So I didn't give up. I dug, and I was able to find a PDF file where somebody had literally gone through and taken pictures of every page of this book. And I read it last night. I read this book cover to cover, and I'm glad that I did because the episode is different because of it. And I thought that it was a good place to lead in. There's a lot of questions when somebody does something like what Jeffrey Dahmer did. And most people are familiar with that. If you're not, don't worry. We're going to go into the particulars of his crimes and his, misdeeds during this episode. But more than likely, you have some idea what he's about. Dahmer, at least in my childhood and as it seems now in my social situation, is synonymous with cannibalism. A guy that freaked out and ate a bunch of people and cut them up and kept parts of them in his refrigerator. And those things are all true. But there seems to be a profound misunderstanding of how he got that way. And they're still up in the air as to whether a psychopath like Dahmer is born or made or some combination of the two. And I'm really interested in knowing the angles on that. Like, what is the possibility that his circumstances led him to be the way he was? And that's really what this book is about and what I want to kind of talk about for a minute here.
So the kind of approach like you said, this book takes, and that's kind of why I think why you had this affinity to it was that you were weighing all these variables, and it's like obviously there's no just concrete answer like this is the conclusion, this is the answer, but it's like you wanted to weigh it from these different angles and see where we could, where the people closest to him could tell the story,
right?
And come out
that
with
was the
something
point.
like that.
I was thinking, like, if you're going to talk about somebody, the closest you're going to get is people that were actually around him. And we've got this now. I'm not saying that the father doesn't do his own version of mythologizing, and we'll talk about that as we go as well.
And create a narrative as well.
But he's definitely the closest source we have to this age. And it's the book actually starts before Jeffrey was ever born, while his mother was pregnant with him. And there's been a lot of studies done on natal anxiety in the mother and the effects of that on the fetus. And his early life was punctuated by that. So Jeffrey was born on May 21st, 1960. And his father describes his wife's pregnancy with Jeffrey to be punctuated by illness, depression, anger, nervousness, and constant argument. He goes on to describe how she was offended by minor noises and smells from the neighbors. And this is not uncommon, I guess, in pregnant women, for smells to become kind of overpowering to them. But he says in this book that she took it to an absolute extreme. They lived in an apartment. You're going to hear other people if you live in an apartment building from time to time.
Of course.
And what came off to him as just normal apartment noise and smells, to her was intolerable. And she would yell and scream constantly while pregnant with Jeffrey. She got worse. Not only was she mentally not very well when she was pregnant with him, she was also physically very ill. Vomited all day long, wasn't able to work. Was very, very just like, and it got worse the later the pregnancy got.
So there were like mental health issues, and there are also physical health issues. Obviously, I don't know if it gets into her nutrition, but a lot of pregnant women need to take prenatal vitamins. So it sounds like she wasn't healthy in either respect.
Yep. He recalls the fights as very heated, but in reading the whole book, he's a very restrained and reserved man. So if he used those words, they were probably knockdown, drag-out, screaming fights while she's pregnant with Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, I wanted to find, is there concrete evidence? And the answer is no.
Right.
They think and theorize, and there's some evidence to suggest that there could be a link to stress in a mother during pregnancy and profound mental illness in a child. But it's not one of those things that we can test ethically.
Right.
We can't just like get a woman pregnant and stress her out.
Here's 100 women who are pregnant. 50 of them we're gonna just torture and subject to inhuman treatment, and the rest we're gonna just coddle and all this other stuff. And otherwise, we're gonna give them the same diet and all this other stuff. Let's just see how they turn out. Yeah, you can't really do that.
I do want to say too that this is the version of the book that I read, the first edition. I was not able to find the re-release with an addendum after his death, so
This is a second edition,
and I don't know if anything was changed from. I'm kind of glad I got the first edition because I don't know if anything was addendum. I like this raw kind of first look at this.
Right, and this one here says it includes a final chapter on the death of Jeffrey Dahmer, which of course your version you said did not.
It does not.
Because he was alive.
He was alive when this was being, published and marketed, which there was a big argument about, the exploitativeness of that.
Yeah, I could see that. Because even that was even something that came up in my mind just thinking about this. It's like, you're going to try to make money selling a book on the fact that your son's a serial killer, but then again, the people probably want to hear about it. Mm-hmm. I don't know if this was a bestseller or how many copies this sold.
No, this was. I mean, it's kind of a cult item. You can tell it's a collector's item. Like they want a good, like a copy of this in really good condition. A first edition is like $200 or more. So it's kind of an underground collector's item. But it's quoted a lot though. See, that's the thing. In pieces about Jeffrey that make speculative like leaps about what his childhood might have been like, this book is heavily quoted out of context, but it's not really a big piece of his mythology. Obviously, it was hard for me to find. You can't just outright buy it. It's just hard to get your hands on, in a way that most books aren't. So he goes on during the pregnancy to describe, and this is kind of strange to me, but it fits a symptom pattern, strange seizures that his wife Joyce would have during the pregnancy that he claims doctors at the time had trouble diagnosing. Doctors suspected a mental root to the attacks rather than a physical. And I looked into it. Nowadays, manic depression is really one of the only things that would line up with. Manic depressives can have episodes that are very like seizures. They have lockdown, sobbing, and that's what he really describes in her. And the doctors treated her. And once again, keep in mind, she's pregnant with Jeffrey at this time, her first child.
Right.
She was administered, and this is a direct quote from the book, morphine and barbiturates, as well as phenobarbital to calm her during these fits. So she was given intravenous hard drugs all throughout her pregnancy with Jeffrey Dahmer.
Which some of those drugs are getting into his system. At that time.
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, because
anything that's in the mother's bloodstream
Right.
is in the child.
That's why you have babies born
But-
addicted to crack and
Right.
stuff. So
Ostensibly, though, I mean,
during the time this fetus is being formed,
a
he's
lot of
being-
mothers go through this kind of thing,
Right.
And they don't end up having the result isn't a serial killer.
Right. Exactly.
It is interesting, but there's a very speculative nature to this too.
Oh, of course.
We have to acknowledge.
Of course, like I said, I wanted to find a concrete study was like, here's, or a concrete group of studies that was like, here's the link, but there isn't one yet. I'm copping to that. It's just an interesting angle to think about. A lot of these factors that are talked about are all there for him. Drugs, high stress in the mother, possible family history of mental illness. All of these things, I don't think it's possible to talk about Jeffrey Dahmer without talking about the implications that these things might have had on him, He also related a strange story about breastfeeding. He said that Joyce, his wife, never took to breastfeeding, couldn't do it, just couldn't get into the groove, and Jeffrey was basically bottle fed with formula. I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not, but I made a note of it. He describes a lot more fighting and mutual avoidance between he and his wife during Jeff's infancy. So after Jeffrey was born, things didn't really get better between Lionel and Joyce. They continued to have a very volatile relationship, and I actually, I'm going to open it up here on my phone. I pulled a picture of...
And here's a couple pictures as well of...
It's so weird to see someone that's so reviled that just as a toddler and just like, yeah, I'm filled with joy, I'm happy.
The book is also dotted with pictures like this that I couldn't find anywhere else. So, like, actually really candid pictures of Jeffrey within the pages of this that I said, I didn't see in any of these resources. So,
Right, so here he is with his dad.
that's him with Lionel, a very, very young infant. That's him with his mother, Joyce, there. And he looks like an altogether kind of happy baby, but most babies at this age do. They're just little larvas that giggle at everything. Another picture of Jeffrey here. Looks like he's about 4 or 5 years old. The reason that I pulled this one was to read this passage, and I'm just going to read this paragraph from the book directly.
Okay.
At this point in the book, Lionel is talking about the fact that he had these memories of raising Jeffrey that became a different thing after he learned what Jeffrey did. Before, they were just normal childhood memories of quirky things that the kid did. And now he picks up by saying the same sense of something dark and shadowy, like what was going on in Jeff's life, a malicious force that was growing in my son, now colors almost every memory I have of his childhood. In a sense, his childhood no longer exists. Everything is now a part of what he did as a man. Because of that, I can no longer distinguish the ordinary from the foreboding, the trivial events from the ones loaded with forbidding. When he was 4 and pointed to his belly button and asked what would happen if someone cut it out, was that merely an ordinary question from a child who'd begun to explore his own body, or was it a sign of something morbid already growing in his mind? When at age 6, Jeff broke several windows out in an old abandoned building, was that only a typical boyhood prank, or was it the early signal of a dark and impulsive destructiveness? When we went fishing, and he seemed captivated by the gutted fish staring intently at the brightly colored entrails, was that a child's normal, natural curiosity, or was it a harbinger of the horror that was later to be found in apartment 213? So he kind of cops in this book to the fact that he can't tell us any more about Jeffrey Dahmer than all of these other news outlets can, really.
Right, because you could look, I mean, he's right. You could look at any of those events and be like, oh, that's normal kid stuff. But
Right.
knowing he's Jeffrey Dahmer, it's kind of like, oh, well, maybe there's something more there.
Well, you can make the evidence fit the conclusion there. You can say,
Right.
oh, look how he looked at these bones or this fish, or look what he did in his life. And it's really easy. And I think it's an easy trap for people to fall into is that when they're speculating because they want to have this concrete reductionist answer like, hey, he did, this is why Jeffrey Dahmer killed people. That's why he had these compulsions. Like, but I think it's too complex. I think people are too complex. There's too many variables in someone's life to simply just point to one thing and say, this is the genesis of this.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if you're in that position of being that father who raised Jeffrey Dahmer, you know,
Sure.
it's hard not to look at those events and be like, was
Oh
it
no,
that?
I
You know?
completely understand where his perspective in this is like, when did it go wrong?
Well, this book is not a salacious examination. He covers these things, but he's always very careful to say, I don't know if this was a sign of that or not.
Right.
Until it becomes obvious that maybe it was. He cops to his own naivete as things got worse.
Right. So eventually,
But
the
this-
signs started piling up, but he kept kind of like, well, you know, boys
This
will
book
be
is
boys.
about Jeffrey Dahmer, and there's a lot of really interesting and useful anecdotes about what he was like as a toddler and a teenager in it. But it's more of a book about Lionel Dahmer and him trying to find, is there a seed in me? Because he sees a lot of himself in his son. He talks about his own mental problems growing up, how he had horrible, murderous dreams, as he calls them. And I don't know if he's using that word metaphorically or if he's using it literally. I don't know if he means he would go to sleep and have horrible dreams of blood and murder and death, or if he would have fantasy. I don't know what he means. He's not more specific than that, but he does talk about having dreams of horrible things.
So he's kind of looking, I mean, like, his son being a serial killer has kind of caused him at the point in his life where he's writing this book to be introspective about what sort of darkness exists within him.
Right.
Could he have maybe ended up going down this same path in life?
He also describes a pattern of coldness and emotional detachment in his life that he cops to very honestly. Now, he doesn't outright diagnose anybody in this book. You won't find Joyce was a manic depressive, Jeffrey was a psychopath, and so am I. But he pretty much, if you read between the lines and know the diagnosis, cops to the fact that he is a sociopath or a psychopath at the very least.
Right.
He doesn't feel empathy in the same way that other people do. He talks very extensively about the fighting between he and his wife being at large part due to the fact that he could not give her the emotional comfort and support that she wanted. He said that he viewed that, his contribution in that way, as I go to work. I work hard, long hours.
Right.
I buy this
As a
beautiful
chemist.
house. I put food on the table. That was his way of giving her love, but she needed something else that he couldn't give.
Right. And he was a scientist. He was a chemist.
A chemist, yes.
He was a member of
which
the,
plays a role later, as we'll get to.
okay.
Absolutely. But he was he found that he was a chemist because in his childhood, in addition to these murderous fantasies or dreams, he developed kind of a firebug type of mentality where he was obsessed with fire.
Right.
He describes a scene where he was at his uncle's house looking at just a log fire and stared at it for the longest time. And it started with fire, and as he got older, it became an obsession with explosives. And that culminated in him getting caught almost blowing up a neighbor's shed trying to do some experiment with gasoline and shit.
Right.
And his dad caught him and gave him a stern talking to, as any dad would. And he wrote this as a direct quote from this part of the book. He says, it would never have occurred to him, talking about his father, that such a fascination might attach itself to my sexuality, that it might hook on to that relentlessly driving engine. His naivete protected him from such dark imaginings. So he's comparing something that we can talk about now, because as Jeffrey got older, and there's some other things that happened to him too that we'll talk about in the interceding months, but as he got older, he started to show a fascination, even from a very young age, with dead things.
Right.
His dad describes a scene where he discovered a bunch of dead animals underneath a house. And they were basically eaten clean by the predators and shit, so they were completely bleach white bones, and he pulled them out, and Jeff was fascinated with them. He loved to look at them and hold them, and he was a toddler at this point, 4, maybe a little older than in this picture here, holding it in his hand. He loved the sound they made, clinking against, he would drop them over and over again. He said he called them fiddlesticks back then, which was a game where you would drop a bunch of sticks.
Right.
But he preferred the bones. And that started at a very young age and carried out throughout his life. There was a weird thing that we'll talk about before we move on to his kind of more adolescent years. When he was about 6, he complained of a pain in his lower regions and ended up having a double hernia that had to be repaired.
Do you have any pictures of him as a kid?
Yeah, you had one up that was probably about that age, somewhere around. I mean, this maybe a little younger, but whatever.
This is him at 4 years old.
Yeah. So at around 6, he had a hernia that was very painful. I mean, I've had a hernia, not in the same area, but hernias are notoriously painful to recover from, and a young kid has a hard time understanding that kind of pain.
Yeah, 6 years old is a very young age to have. I mean, almost surprising to have that kind of a problem at that age, but of course it's always possible.
And Lionel describes that he feels like kind of a light went out in Jeffrey when that happened. He said that before the injury and the long recovery from it, where he was in a lot of pain, he was way more limp and kind of just a noodly, very whimsical boy. And after that, he says that he was more withdrawn, sadder, and walked with a more stiffer, kind of upright thing that lasted his entire life. So I don't know, once again, if that's him just projecting something dark onto a normal childhood. You know, he was,
I mean, like a child that age, that'd be a very traumatic experience to have. I mean, and that could have a profound impact on somebody's life, especially I mean, 6 years old is kind of when you're really starting to form like long-term permanent memories of things. And it's like, imagine one of your first memories being like, you have to go have this thing happen. You have to have this surgery. And now it's like you have to recover and you can't do things and be a kid anymore.
Hernia is terrible. I mean,
so... Oh yeah.
You don't hear that about,
and experience the pain. I mean, and have that visceral fear of death.
And it was in his crotch. It was his scrotal. It was like a scrotal hernia. So it's a very painful place to have anything happen.
I mean, that's old enough to have some sort of conception.
There was a thing
of
that he
death.
wrote in here that I thought was weird that I've never heard quoted anywhere else. He asked his mother after the surgery if they had cut his penis off because he was in so much pain.
Right.
So he was afraid that they had emasculated him.
Right.
So this may have had something to do with his pathology.
I mean, it's a formative year. It's a formative memory. I mean, you're still becoming who you are as a person. You already have this fascination with death. There's already this possibility that maybe the forming of your brain has been affected by your mom being subjected to a lot of different drugs during the pregnancy and a lot of stress and all this other stuff.
But also, I mean, a child would blame themselves in a way. It's like they could be like, I was fucked up. I'm flawed because I needed this surgery.
Yeah, and then he has this memory of it didn't actually happen, but I mean, in his head, it must have been like they've chopped my dick off, basically.
He clearly thought that.
Right. So, I mean, like, the memory of it is the memory of, like, that time that my penis got cut off.
Right.
Even if he knows that's not what actually happened.
So the book really is divided into 2 parts. One of them is kind of Jeffrey's childhood, and one of them is what happened in Lionel's life after he learned of what Jeffrey did and how he tries to find links. And he becomes less of a reliable source in Jeffrey's teen years because he describes and cops to a growing distance between he and Jeffrey. The way he described their relationship was very cursory. He said, we talked, we didn't converse. So they would, how you doing in school today, son? Good, Dad. How was work? Great, son. Basically, that level of kind of interaction was what existed between them.
There's no real bond between them. It's kind of like, it's almost like business-like.
Right.
Your life is going well. My life is going well. Good.
It's not all that atypical for a parent and a teen and a son or a daughter to kind of have a little bit of a divergence during those years.
Lionel is very candid in this book and cops to it being more than a little divergence.
Right.
He said it was just an absolute almost coldness,
a chasm, and
he tried
between them.
He says he tried various times to force Jeff, who he describes all throughout this book as almost irreparably shy, which will come up later as well. Trying to get Jeff to engage in life and make friends and go do things, and Jeff was in a litany of activities. So this, there's no argument to be made that they didn't attempt to engage him. Let me give you a list of some of the things that he was in. Tennis, soccer, band, archery, Boy Scouts, bodybuilding, Jeff tried and dropped out of them all.
Right.
So he would initially show a big burst of interest, and he liked, oh, man, this gives me something to focus my energy. But eventually it wasn't what he wanted, and
So they kept trying to find these structures for him to exist within, but he just kept finding himself maladapted to any social environment they tried to force him to enter into.
Right. And he says that unbeknownst to him, at this time, Dahmer's toddler obsession with animal bones had progressed into a full-blown adolescent obsession. So at this point, he was roaming the neighborhood alone at night with trash bags, collecting roadkill, dismembering it and burying it in a private cemetery in the woods near his family's house.
Right.
He also had a shed later in his teen years where he used acid that he got from his dad's laboratory work to dissolve these animals in various ways and see what the acid did to the flesh, which would come to play later in his life.
And he was killing animals too, right? It was
later in his teen years, he did talk about killing squirrels, small woodland animals, and a dog.
right.
Or actually, I don't know. I guess it's up in the air as to whether he killed the dog or not.
Okay.
But he was definitely killing animals, finding roadkill, and it just was an obsession.
Mostly he was just looking for things that was already dead that he could exploit and repurpose and have his fascination with the bones and the guts.
Well, I mean,
Right.
And the body
It seems
parts.
like like you said, he searched for something, sort of structure, and the way that what he found was like this obsession with these animals, and like what each channel was like, I want to see the inside of this animal, I want to dissolve this animal, I want to like have everything, like to see this animal in every form it can be in once it's dead. I wanna see
He
its
was very
bones,
much into that.
Its
He
brains.
was very interested in the colors of things on the inside and whether he wondered whether black people were the same color as him on the inside. This is something that he mused about after being captured. And said that he'd always wondered and found out eventually through his explorations.
It's a shame that he didn't stumble upon the field of taxidermy, dude.
Well, here's the thing.
Could have channeled everything into taxidermy. You know?
Before we hand the baton off to another member of his life,
Right.
because, like I said, Lionel becomes a less reliable witness at this point.
Yeah, because there's a big chasm between them.
Oh man, fuck, man. I just had it in my head. There was one last thing that I think that he had to offer. Oh, it was an examination of himself. He said that he feels like he was able to channel those darker impulses and drives into chemistry, and he became obsessed with it, and it was his lifelong obsession
Right.
and work. And he thought at the time when he found out that Jeffrey was pickling these animals and dissolving them and experimenting with them, that what he was seeing was maybe the same thing, a burgeoning interest that would turn into a biology career, a surgery career. Somebody that was just, he thought he would be able to find a way to help Jeffrey channel that.
Right.
In the same way he was able to channel his firebug ways and his explosive obsession
Right.
into a career.
But whatever it was, there was just no.
He never made that
There's
connection.
never that pivotal shift.
He never found that channel.
Like he said earlier, Jeffrey made a different connection, a sexual connection.
We had a when we covered Jack the Ripper, and I mean, obviously we don't know if this is necessarily true, but I mean, from the evidence left behind, I mean, also a fascination with the inside of people, man. That's a parallel between
Right.
these two. That's
And
like,
you saw, well, if
like,
we
like
go
what,
back
what,
to the,
what is inside a person?
if we
What
go
is
back to the
inside an
Jack
animal?
the Ripper thing, remember, each one of his kills seemed to be more extreme than the last.
More
Right.
It progressed more and more.
It
was
progressed more, and like at first it was just, I'm just going to kill you. And by the time he got to his fourth or fifth victim or whatever it was,
More
he was
elaborate, and he was more
stringing
comfortable.
guts all over the room, and
Well, the same
playing
as
with
we'll
the body
see.
parts and all that stuff.
Some things remain the same. At this point, though, TJ, I want to kind of hand it off to you and let you have not in terms of like forever, but just let's have a discussion about My Friend Dahmer, which is a graphic novel that you loaned to me the first time I visited Ohio,
Yeah, that's right.
and I read cover to cover. And
Yeah, one of the kids that went to high school with Jeffrey Dahmer and actually was in his social circle.
his name is John Backdurf.
Yes. Actually grew up to become an artist and a writer, comic book author. He wrote a graphic novel. My Friend Dahmer was recently adapted into a film.
Which I watched last night, by the way, so we can talk about that.
And I
when
have
we get
not
to
seen
it.
the film
Yeah.
yet. But,
Neither have I.
I read the graphic novel, and I did lend it to Paul a few
2 years ago.
a few years ago, maybe
Yeah,
2
a couple years ago.
a year ago, something like that. And here you see some of the art. It's a really well-written story. art maybe is not the greatest in the universe, but it's pretty good.
It's a profoundly, and I don't think it goes out of its way to be, because it really isn't wholly empathetic as a work, but given the way that people portray Jeffrey Dahmer, it's a profoundly empathetic look at his life.
It's a very humanizing look, for sure. It really kind of, the message that I got driven home from it was, first of all, the main thing that people should understand, I think, if they haven't read this or they're not going to read this or see this or whatever.
Which you should, by the way.
Right. The main thing is that Jeffrey seemed to survive in high school by making people laugh. Not necessarily with him, but more often at him because of the things that he would do, the ways that he would get attention. And because of that, he attracted sort of a circle of people who were entertained by the foolish and outlandish things that he was willing to do.
His willingness to make a fool and mockery of himself made him kind of a cult figure in his high schools.
Right, and it made him, it propelled him over, a rung up on the social ladder from where he probably would have been.
Right.
Because he was willing to humiliate himself, and he was willing to denigrate himself, and he was willing to do the outrageous things that other people wanted to see and didn't have the courage to do themselves.
It kind of like when you think of a psychopath too, you're always kind of given this image of like the CEO of the company, like or a person who's very likable and forges these really strong relationships, like where people feel like this person genuinely cares about me, but to them it's like this is a social piece.
Yeah, Jeffrey didn't really have much
social
of that.
chess piece.
He had to survive socially in a different way.
Well, if you think about it, though, this is just another tactic, right? He wanted what other people had in some way.
Right.
Now, he definitely wanted a distance from it, but he wanted to be perceived as they were. And he's not a CEO, you know what I mean? He wasn't in that position, but socially, his inlet to people to get them to look at him with anything other than utter disgust, disdain, and unrecognition was to just make a fool of himself. And that allowed him entry to social circles. It gave him friends, gave him all these clubs that he joined and
so he was able to
dropped out of
all that using that tactic.
Absolutely.
It didn't make him the most popular kid in school, obviously, but it made him sort of a cult figure in his school, like Paul said.
But if you examine it, it's kind of sad. I mean, there's
no real
friendship there.
Right. It's almost like they're just around you to laugh at you, and you're just accepting of that.
It's not almost like that. It's exactly that.
That's what it is. Yeah. Well, I mean, as far as humanizing, it's like
there was no sort of nothing in the book kind of hints at any sort of like real human connection with anybody else around him.
But I mean, very little, if at all, and what it was always stilted and strange.
I think that's the interesting thing, like you guys mentioned about the graphic novel, is that it humanizes, because a lot of times we forget about people when we're telling stories about their lives, especially people that have done atrocious things, that in their day-to-day lives, I mean, there's Jeffrey Dahmer still fucking ate breakfast.
Yeah,
he still went out and did shit. He
still took a shit.
He still had people maybe he in his own way cared about them. Like he still had relationships with certain people. Like it wasn't like he was just like, I am evil and I'm going to kill now. It's like, and we often forget that we just see their crimes. We don't see them as a person. We see what they've done.
I mean, that's, to me, it's kind of dangerous that people have that mentality, because when it prevents people from really doing what Jeffrey Dahmer's dad did after his son's crimes came to light, which is have that introspection about who you are, and the darkness within yourself. Because if you just say, well, there's no darkness in me like that, it's just this monster that did it.
It's a crime that book, not to go back to it, that it isn't more available, because it's not a salacious book. Like any fervor that was about that being exploitative was completely misplaced, in my opinion. It's a short, succinct book, but it is not an exploitative book. It sounds
to me, from what you've talked about, it sounds like it was a thoughtful book about introspection.
It sounds like a lot of people, the popular culture that it did affect, it was cherry picked out to fit a narrative or fit a story of like, this is how extreme he was, how crazy he was, and it kind of misses the entire point, is what you're saying.
Oh, absolutely. And in this work, we find the same kind of seeking absolution, I think, from John Backdorf. He's doing the same thing that Lionel's doing. He's wanting to contextualize his contribution to Jeff's psyche and explain it away and find out what in him drove him to be the kind of person that would find this person who's clearly troubled and make them humiliate themselves over and over again. So there's a lot of introspection in My Friend Dahmer as well. And they're very similar works in terms of describing Jeffrey's demeanor. He doesn't outright call. Well, he describes Jeffrey as impenetrably shy before he started acting out in this strange way. And in the center panel in the thing TJ has on the screen here, you see him saying, "I'm a decorator," and he's acting like a person that is mentally retarded or has, in this case, cerebral palsy. The person he was imitating was some weird interior decorator that his mother had hired to look at their house and do things with it, and he had cerebral palsy, and he talked and walked and acted strange.
I think one element, though, that's interesting about these works is that, and I agree that they're definitely introspective works, but they're also exercising a little bit of narcissism, because it's like, how did I affect this? Was I a catalyst? Was I a part of this?
And what is my role in what
is
he
my
did?
role in this? Because obviously, at the end of the day, this is a product to be sold.
I think anybody
too.
would ask themselves that, though.
And that's
I think it's a
something
fair
that-
question. I'm not saying it's an unfair question to ask, but I'm saying when you do it, I can see the argument of like, this is exploitative because obviously this is for sale. This is something,
Right?
And that the hook is this is about Jeffrey Dahmer, which we know a lot of people are fascinated with the serial killers.
Sure.
Let's touch on this now. Like, I don't want it to stymie more discussion of my friend Dahmer because there's more meat on this bone.
Of course, yeah.
Let's touch on this now. I went looking when I pulled for this episode. What I ultimately pulled was I wanted to get, to the best of my ability, firsthand testimony from what he was like as a kid, what he was like growing up. But I didn't find it. I found some great resources and maybe some great insights into what he might have been like, but I found more mythology. I found Lionel Dahmer's mythology about him as a father and how he perceived Jeffrey and his actions. I found John Backdurf's mythology about how he perceived Jeffrey as a teenager and how he interacted with Jeffrey and what that might have meant. I didn't get any truth. There is no truth. The only person that knows that was Jeffrey Dahmer, and he ain't around to answer no more questions. But I do think that it's important to look at the people that were closest to him. That's why I pulled it this way. I mean, would you rather I pull a BuzzFeed article on the 10 things you didn't know about Jeffrey Dahmer? You know what I mean?
No,
Of course not.
There's a zoom on Jeffrey Dahmer when you talk about people that knew him. And yes, you're absolutely right, Scotty. There's huge ego at play in both of these men. John Backdurf wanting to make himself the guy that mythologizes Dahmer before the killings. Lionel wanting to paint himself as just a troubled father that didn't know any better.
But you kind of see this as like a path of like, look, we're never going to get the truth or whatever that is, but this is like...
This is the best we can do.
This is the best we can do.
Right.
Yeah.
Other than
I agree
rank
with
speculation.
I agree with you. And look, rampant speculation is always going to be part of these stories because we don't, there wasn't a fucking drone following around Jeffrey Dahmer 365, 24/7,
Look, because
from conception till death.
So few people in life end up serial killers. It's a very strange pathology. And because of that, people want an answer. And so, if they think someone has that answer, they're going to look to that person.
Of course.
And, is there probably there's probably pieces of the puzzle in those books.
Oh, yeah.
But are there answers? No, there's not. You're never going to have that answer. You're never going to know what contributed to what he did and what didn't. And by the way, you see here in this last panel, another thing the book gets into is Dahmer's descent into alcoholism.
Can you read
at
that?
a very young age.
Can you read that? These two panels are beautiful. Like one of my a hair raising kind of part of this.
I suppose this behavior could be shrugged off as typical teenage stuff, but there was also the drinking. Every morning before class, this 15-year-old small-town kid would pound back an entire six-pack in the parking lot, virtually gulping down the cans one after another. A lot of kids got high, but this was different, darker. He was getting numb. And you see that picture of him where he's so shrouded in shadow there.
So Jeffrey Dahmer was an alcoholic.
At a young age.
And he remained one all the way throughout his life.
Right, till his dying day.
Till his dying day.
Well, maybe not in prison,
I
don't
guess
know.
by a certain line of thinking, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic.
Right, of course. Sure.
But he was an alcoholic, and it began manifesting itself in him at what a lot of people would consider to be a very, very young age. 15, 14 years old, to be pounding six-packs. And, I drank a lot in high school. I went and partied with my friends, but I never pounded any fucking six-packs in the parking lot before school.
Just so you could handle the day.
Yeah, I would smoke a J before school or something with my friends, but never, Durf is right here. There's something different about that. And Jeffrey was definitely, and look, this book, one of the things about this book is it's kind of a wake-up call not only to people that wanted to know more about Jeffrey Dahmer, but to like people that work in education and shit. Like, look at this kid that slipped through the cracks right here.
Right.
One of the things that's typified by this book, if you remember it, TJ, is that even though he was doing these crazy things that eventually kind of ominously became referred to in the high school he went to as doing a Dahmer. So he spawned this kind of meme of running around the high school and scaring people by running up behind them and going, "Duh!"
He was a minor cult of personality at the
Right.
school.
And it elevated him to a certain point. So there were actually outcasts at the show at the school that had a way lower social standing than Jeff did, a way lower access to social interaction than Jeff did. So he went under the radar for that reason. By all intents and purposes, taking a cursory look at his life, an administrator might think, "Oh, he's got friends at least." You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's doing some people.
Yeah, he's
people in the
hanging out
school
with them
recognize.
kids
He's got
over
a
there.
buddy.
You know, the thing about alcoholism, and I mean, obviously, this is something he struggled with his whole life too. And
TJ.
Yes.
one of the things that he struggled with, I mean, obviously, was alcoholism. But the thing is that me and TJ knew an alcoholic guy named JD for many years, and the one time I really talked to him about alcoholism, like, because a lot of times, obviously, people who are alcoholics avoid that conversation. I was like, "Why the fuck do you drink?" I said, "Every night I hear you. You wake up." Then I'm at my mom's house because he lived underneath the house.
Yeah.
Long story. And I was like, every night, and I just confronted him. I said, "Every night I hear you, and you walk out to where the tree line is of the woods, because they live on like several acres, and you just vomit profusely." I said, "And you put yourself through this, and obviously you're in a lot of pain and it's anguish." He's like, and I said, "Why do you do it?" He's like, "Well, I'm just in a lot of pain." I'm like, "Well, a lot of people are in pain." He's like, "Well, this is the only way I can deal with reality, basically." And sometimes in his case, I wonder if it's like, was he dealing with all the pain from all the things that happened in his life, or was that the only thing that helped him contain what he was to become?
I mean, this book, it contains a lot of insights about, and a lot of the insights in this book are derived from what Durf learned after the fact. But it alludes to a lot of the things that were going on in Jeffrey's life as we know it now. Killing animals,
Yeah, and
collecting roadkill, getting ever stranger and ever more.
and there's definitely, and correct me if you disagree with this,
Okay.
Paul. There's definitely a force in the book that that goes to what Scotty was saying about the idea of Jeff using alcohol to try to calm the demons that are inside of him. You know, not literal demons, but just like the
internal
urges
struggle
that he's obviously feeling underneath all this, because you know there's a narrative that kind of leads you to draw the conclusion that the reason he's drinking is because he's trying to contain all of this darkness within him and shit.
Right. And the drinking, once again, I grew up around an alcoholic as well, very close to me. Alcoholism manifests itself very differently in every alcoholic. There are some alcoholics known as functional alcoholics,
Right,
who drink every day, all day, but manage to keep a job. That's the kind that I grew up around, a functional alcoholic.
I knew one of those too.
There are non-functional alcoholics that are just completely at the mercy of the state or the street, basically. And then there's people that are somewhere in the middle, binge drinking alcoholics. And there are all kinds of permutations, all of these. So it's not an easy thing. You can't say you understand Jeffrey Dahmer because he was an alcoholic.
Right, exactly.
That's
Oh, yeah,
just
definitely
another
not.
piece of this puzzle. But it's a warning sign in a lot of people, because there's one thing that's common to all alcoholics, and that's avoidance.
Oh, yeah.
They drink to avoid, whether it's psychological trauma, personal trauma, things that have actually happened or are happening. Avoidance, avoidance, avoidance. And what was he avoiding at this time? Well, at the same time that this was going on, he was, by his own admission, sitting in the bushes near a jogging trail near his home, where guys would often jog by, dudes that were in good shape, and slowly but surely, at first watching them, sometimes touching himself in the bushes and shit, but more it was about coming up with a plan to club one of them over the head and rape them. And he was doing that at this time in his spare time, along with killing woodland animals and making an ever more concrete connection between his weird fetish for bones and internal organs and violence and sex, And what that expressed as in these early days was necrophilia. His fantasy was to kill a man, take him home, and then not only just have sex with him, but lay with him. Like, lay his head on his chest, be near him. It was almost as if he wanted a dead body, and this is common to a lot of necrophiliacs, that didn't need the things that a human would need, but that he could still use as kind of a toy and get off to.
Right. Like a prop almost.
And that was the beginnings.
Ultimate power fantasy too, by the way.
Absolutely.
There's no.
Well, not all necrophiliacs are murderers. Some fantasize about finding a dead body or breaking in and getting a dead body.
I mean, let's not besmirch the fine name of necrophiliacs here on this show, but
I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something different about wanting to kill somebody and then fuck them than there is just wanting to fuck a dead body.
Of course,
right? Yeah.
Not making excuses. I hate corpse fuckers as much as the next guy.
I don't hate it. What the hell? I mean, they want to fuck a corpse. I
mean, I don't want them fucking my mom. You want them fucking your mom's corpse?
I mean, I don't know if I wouldn't.
What if they broke into the fucking mausoleum and was fucking your mama's corpse?
See, she didn't consent. But you know what? If they want to fuck my corpse after I'm dead, I'm okay with it.
Okay, well, that's cool. I hope a necrophiliac digs your ass up and
when
fucks
TJ
it.
kicks the bucket.
I just want it known because I don't have a will or anything. So let this serve as my will. If I die, and a necrophiliac out there wants to come claim the body, you go ahead. Because I think, hey.
What a great gift you've given to necrophiliacs everywhere, TJ.
I know, right? Because I'm a nice fucking guy.
But that's how it manifested itself in Jeff. He really didn't have any sexual run-ins. This book is very coy on his sexuality. Although it does touch on it, it's very careful to not... Because I guess he never really expressed any of that towards his close group of friends.
Right.
And so he really was very sexually repressed. You gotta understand, at this time, this is the 80s, right? The 70s and the 80s when he's in high school. Actually, the 70s.
Right.
Not a good time to be gay.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
So he was definitely all the way in the closet. He probably didn't even understand his attraction.
I felt
he
like
can't come out as like Liberace again, like, I'm fabulous.
I felt like there was a little bit of that in this book as well, that's saying like, maybe the repression of homosexuals had something to do with why
it's another puzzle piece.
Well, look at a lot of countries in the Middle East or Southeast Asia where people are very sexually repressed, or just anywhere in the world where that exists.
And they're a little more violent.
Yeah, there's a lot more instances of violence because people are repressing emotions and their own desires and their own wants and the things that they actually truly want. It's like you can't have that, so it's like that just has to be channeled somewhere else.
And I mean, like, I'm sure as a gay dude, he probably felt like at that time there was no way for him to enter into a relationship. Like it's almost like, hey, it's just like the melding of taboos by having this unnecessary taboo against homosexuality. They might have pushed him
another thing
into an even darker taboo that actually has social ills attached to it.
Right. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but another thing I read about Jeffrey Dahmer too is that some people have theorized he had Asperger's. So he was on the autistic spectrum. So I mean, obviously, social problems go part and parcel.
That is absolutely possible. I'm always
I don't know,
careful about trying to go like, he was this, he was that. This person was obviously that. I do it, and I hate it when I do it because I hate it when people do it to me. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, he may have had some kind of social deficiency like Asperger's or some kind of spectrum. He might have been on the spectrum somewhere. And this was at a time where there was literally no knowledge or treatment of that.
I mean, I almost feel like when people are searching for an answer to this guy, it's like almost like he has it's just like on the luck tree, he had every branch on the way down. It's
well,
like
it wasn't
the
luck,
bad
though.
luck tree, rather.
Oh, the bad luck tree. Oh, yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, but it doesn't seem that way on the surface, though. On the surface of it, he had a very normal suburban life. Successful dad, chemist, big house, nice car.
Well, as they always say, appearances can be deceiving.
Absolutely. There's another interesting anecdote. I don't know if you remember it from this my friend Dahmer, TJ. He actually instrumented a face-to-face meeting with Walter Mondale.
I do remember that.
He was in one of his many clubs that he joined and then eventually dropped out of. He was part of a newspaper club that ended up getting a trip to Washington, D.C., and his friends were kind of ribbing him about like, hey, we didn't get to see anybody. And he was like, hey, we can go see the vice president. And they were like, shut up. And he went to a payphone, according to this book, called the vice president's office number, got an appointment to meet with a secretary that worked there, and by social engineering ended up being in the vice president's office at the time when he got there, and just, I guess, a combination of luck and guile, So he was a smart dude. There was a focus for him,
Right.
that could have led him to be something that gave to this society.
I mean, another thing you got to think about too is just to get away with that many murders, you have to be clever.
Oh, fuck yeah. He was not a dumb fuck.
Right. I mean,
He was a dumb fuck on paper, though.
right.
Never did good in school, was a terrible student for most of his life. Even worse in college, just absolutely, you know what I mean? If you look at him through that narrow lens, wow, what a dummy. Couldn't do the school thing, but he
Right.
was smarter than the average bear on multiple fronts.
Right. I mean, you can't look when serial killers kill a bunch of people like the Zodiac, and they use it to say, "Look at my superiority. Look at my superiority." Well, on some level, they have a fucking point.
Yeah.
Because you cannot get away with a bunch of murders. Increased scrutiny from the police. Like, every time I watch an episode of Forensic Files, which I watch as I go to sleep at night because I like the guy's voice that narrates the shit. Oftentimes you hear the police say, he thought he was smart, but he wasn't smarter than us. All right, so are you admitting that people like the Zodiac Killer are smarter than you because
Yeah.
they got away with it?
I mean, they are, implicitly.
Right. I mean,
If you can get away with it, then you're smarter than the cops. I mean, that's true. That's true on the face
getting
of it.
harder, though, but,
Oh, yeah, you're right about that.
forensics constantly improving.
One last little thing. I want to talk real briefly about the My Friend Dahmer film that was released in 2017. I watched
play
it.
that trailer? Or,
Yeah, I did pull the trailer, and if you want to watch it, I think we should.
all right.
Let's go ahead and take a look.
I now present to you Jeff.
Jeffrey. For this, I'm Jeffrey.
Okay. Then I present to you Jeffrey Dahmer in his command performance.
Out of the way, Dahmer. Dumbass. I wish I had a best friend.
Jeff's a little off, I think he's kind of hilarious. Hey, Jeff, do you want to come sit at our table?
I think we should form a fan club. With you as our fearless leader, we can really disrupt the school.
Everybody ready?
It has been difficult with your mother, so I moved into a motel.
Take a deep breath.
Are you okay?
Hey, Dahmer, it's in the bag.
You seem healthy to me.
What about what's on a patient's mind?
We need to talk about Jeff.
What is this? You wouldn't know about the kids because you're not at home anymore. You want to talk to somebody about it?
I see things in you that I don't like about myself. I want you to have friends in ways that I never could.
I thought you stopped.
Dad always told me what to do, just like you, just like you.
I like bones. It interests me. What's inside?
God, Dahmer, you are such a freak.
He's not a sideshow attraction.
We're just having fun,
Get out of your shell. You need to be more normal.
I'm just like anybody else.
So, Paul, you've seen the film. I haven't seen it.
I got to tell you, I watched the trailer first, and I wanted to watch it because I thought it would be interesting fodder for me to shit on here. The trailer was not impressive to me. It doesn't look all that great. It looks a little bit salacious. It's not. It's not. It's nowhere. Like, my recommendation is obviously get the long graphic novel if you want to check this out.
Right.
If you're not going to
Right
do
from
that,
the
though,
horse's mouth,
you're
yeah.
not going to go wrong checking this one out. I think you should watch it in particular. You guys should definitely check
I'll
it
check
out.
it
But
out.
anybody in I recommend it to anybody in the audience that probably isn't going to find the time to read the graphic novel. It's a decent representation of the part of that novel. And before we hand off the baton once again, because at this point in Jeffrey's life, John Backdurf becomes not that great of a witness either, because Jeffrey exits his life in a scene that I kind of want to talk about from the film and the graphic novel that's really eerie. after they graduated, and towards the end of graduation, all of the things in Jeffrey's life kind of accelerated. The drinking got worse. He became way more isolated at school. He wasn't wanting to do the Dahmers anymore. He wasn't wanting to anymore. He was very reclusive, and he was failing out. His parents' marriage, incidentally, or maybe not so incidentally at the same time, was crumbling and falling apart at the seams. And John Backdorf describes a time where, they'd made Jeff do this horribly embarrassing thing in the mall in front of a bunch of people from the town, and all of them felt kind of bad about it after the fact because he was at a bad place in his life, obviously, and he was just being so reserved. And he tried to make friends with him. He saw him walking home one night in the dark along a wooded road near his house, and John Backdorf pulled over and picked up Jeffrey and said, "Hey, man, let me give you a ride home." And they were friends, from school. They'd been a little estranged, but they were friends. Went back to Jeffrey's house, which at this time had been vacated by his parents, and he was there by himself. His dad had left for the divorce, and his mom wanted to go off with a lover of hers and didn't want the dad to know. And so she said, "Hey, Jeff, I'll let you stay here, but don't tell your dad." So that's what was going on.
Right.
He's alone. And he and Backdorf pulled up to Jeff's house, which was completely dark, like all the lights out. And he's like, "Man, your house is dark." He's like, "Oh, yeah, I got it to myself." Basically, the conversation between them led to Jeffrey wanting him to come inside and have a few beers. And for whatever reason, despite the fact that he'd done it before with Jeff, despite the fact that they'd been friends, this time he didn't do it. He said something about it, The movie makes it a little more salacious than the comic does. The comic says, I think it says that John doesn't ever go in with him. In the movie, he does and then runs out.
Okay.
But, he might have been, because it wasn't long after this that we hand over the baton, unfortunately, to the tender mercies of the media and to Jeffrey himself.
Well, I mean, it kind
the
of
first
makes
killing.
sense. Yeah, it kind of makes sense, dude.
This is another panel from the comic here.
Beautiful, by the way. This is an incident that Backdorf describes where they all went fishing, and they were catching a fish that was protected that they were supposed to be catch and release. And Jeffrey caught one, and while nobody was paying attention, just absolutely eviscerated it with a fishing knife that he was supposed to use to cut it free and release it. And
he released it from this mortal coil.
Yeah, I guess so. Anyway.
Here's another comic where
I really can't recommend enough that you read this book if you're interested in this beyond what we talk about tonight, because it's really good. Yeah. But now, like I said, John Backdorf leaves our story, and we're left with the media and Jeffrey himself. And the first murder that took place happened in 1978. It was 3 weeks after his graduation, so around the time in the story we just talked about.
Is this
he committed
his picture
his first
of that victim, by the way?
Yes, it is. This is
Stephen Hicks.
Stephen Hicks, yes. Stephen Hicks was, by all means, just a normal kid. He was at a concert. I don't remember exactly what concert it was. I didn't take that note. But he was at a concert, and he was looking to get home back to Akron, Ohio, basically. And he was hitchhiking, which was pretty common back then. And Jeffrey pulled up to him, according to his own testimony and confession, pulled up to him, said, "Hey, man, I live around here. You want to come to my pad? I got a big pad, and I got beer, and I got reefer or whatever. You want to come party?" And the guy was like, "Sure. All right, bro, I'll come party for a little bit." So he went to Jeff's house, and they drank, maybe smoked a little. And then the guy was like, "Well, bro, time for me to leave." And Jeffrey did not want him to leave, tried to convince him to stay, but the guy was pretty adamant. He had to get going, had to get back home, had to find a way home. And as he went to turn to leave, Jeffrey clubbed him over the head with a weightlifting dumbbell. And that didn't kill him outright. And I'm going from Jeffrey's confession here because there's a lot of the mythology creeps in again when it comes to these victims, especially this first one. People want this victim to be like, "Oh, this is the perfect expression of what Dahmer would become." And so a lot of things have been projected onto this. I've heard people say that They definitely were smoking a bunch of weed. Dahmer never said they were smoking weed. They might have.
Yeah, who knows?
I've heard things that they fucked. Dahmer never said that they fucked. I heard that Dahmer raped this kid. Dahmer never fucking copped to any rape, and there was really no reason for him to be coy about it at that point. He was admitting to 17 murders and was going to be sentenced to 936 years in prison. So really, he's the best witness we have for these murders and what happened to them. Because in a lot of cases, as was the case with, what was his name, Stephen Hicks?
Yeah.
Yep.
As with Stephen Hicks here, what Dahmer did, what he admits to doing was beating him over the head with the dumbbell, choking him with it until he was dead, masturbating over his body, and then taking it to a crawl space where he dismembered it. He cut meat from bone. He eventually pulverized all of those bones and then went out in the woods near his family home and spread them all over the woods. And then used chemicals that he'd learned growing up, dissolving all the roadkill, to dissolve all of the meat slowly but surely in jars and shit, and then flushed it all down the toilet. So we have to take Jeffrey Dahmer's word on what happened here, because there is literally no other evidence. They are not going to piece this body together.
He didn't flush everything down the toilet because he actually had the body in his car at one point, like dismembered body parts.
Right. This wasn't all at once. It took him, like I said, it took him a long time to slowly but surely break this body down.
Right.
So he had it in the crawl space in his car.
There was a point where he had dismembered body parts of Stephen Hicks in his car, and he was pulled over by the police.
Yes.
And the cop thought he was drunk, actually gave him a field sobriety test, eventually cleared him and told him he could go.
Yep. And that wasn't the only time that Jeffrey would have a scary brush with almost getting caught. We'll get to that as we get a little deeper into his victim list.
I mean, it's just interesting to see the parallels. Like when you look at that, the graphic novel, like you said, they talk about he catches the fish, and it's just like he's graduating. It's like he finally gets to the point in his life where he's finally confident enough to be like, this is what I really want to do. This is what I really want to have in my life. And just, so I can kind of understand why, based on all the stuff that's out there, why people would think, oh, they fucked, or they smoked weed, or they did this, or they did that. But it's like, I mean, the version he tells kind of sounds like I'm not sure if it's 100%, but it seems very plausible for his character, I will say.
I would say so, too.
Now, Jeff did not do another murder, at least that we know about.
So that is another
for quite
strange,
a while after that.
Another strange part of Jeff where he kind of breaks pattern with serial killers, although not totally. There have been other serial killers that go very long times in between kills, and he was one of those. If we're to believe Jeffrey Dahmer, he didn't kill again for 9 years after this.
Right.
And his intervening life is one...
We saw that with BTK, too, remember?
Mm-hmm.
BTK, he had a couple victims. His kills.
Yeah,
they
he
got
did.
the first time he killed. It was a long time before he killed again, and then they got progressively faster.
Yep.
Once
and the same thing happened here. But 9 years is a long time, and in the intervening years, we get to say hello again to his father once more, because he becomes a little bit involved in Jeff's life. His alcoholism after this murder overwhelmed him. And his father describes him during this time. And actually, this picture here, we'll get to that in a second, but it's a good one. You can leave it up. His father describes him during this time, right after graduation. He had done this murder. He went to college and just absolutely was gone from it. You know what I mean? He failed it out, just dropped out. Was drinking. Obviously, his father had been caught onto his drinking at this point in his life, and his father wrote this about that point in Jeff's life. He says, "Now when I think of him at that point in his life, I see him caught in his own murderous fantasies, trapped in the memory of a murder he had already committed, barely able to connect to any other part of reality. For him, a sudden, uncontrollable act of violence and sexual mutilation had thrust any hope for an ordinary life into a world that was utterly beyond his grasp." So he said that Jeff was very drunk and very reclusive during this time. And finally, Lionel got fed up with it and insisted that Jeff join the military. And he did. He joined the Army. And this is a part of his life, too, that I learned something that I'd never heard. Jeff according to Lionel in the book, went to the military. And at first, like a lot of the other projects that they had tried to give him, he took to it like a duck to fucking water.
Right.
You can see him in this picture. That's Jeffrey Dahmer on the left there. That's not him in the center. That's his younger brother. Jeffrey Dahmer's on the left there. And I mean, he looks like he's got his shit together. This is him right after basic training.
Right.
So this is him on the visit home after basic before he ships off to his duty.
So it's kind of like a pattern I've seen so far as well is that it's like a flash in the pan. Like he really takes to something because it almost feels like it seems like to him it's like this is gonna be the thing that's like it's gonna make my life make sense. This is the piece of the puzzle that I've always been missing.
Yep.
But it's like it's just so strange how it's just you go from that like like I said weightlifting and he was and he did archery and all this stuff and now he's gonna be in the army and the army takes over your life totally. Like when you join the military, like your freedom and autonomy are gone for that time period, especially if you're just active duty.
Right.
In Lionel's book, he says that, Jeffrey was dishonorably discharged after 3 years of service in the Army for his alcoholism. And that's as deep as Lionel goes into it, because that's as much as Lionel knew at the time. There have since been credible allegations that have come out of 2 men, at least, that claim to have been raped by Dahmer during that 3-year service. Here's some of the testimony of 2 of them that I found. So the first one, his last name is Davis, Preston Davis. Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to work in a medic unit with Preston Davis. Today, Davis, 54, believes he was drugged by Dahmer inside an armored personnel vehicle, and then it happened. I was raped by Jeffrey. I'm just thankful to be alive to tell that story. Davis left Baumholder and was replaced by a 17-year-old from Arkansas, Billy Joe Capshaw. The 2 are now friends, bound together as the 2 only known survivors of Dahmer's assaults. For Capshaw, it began the day he and Dahmer, an Army medic, were put into a room together. The assaults began at once, and eventually he leapt from the 3rd-floor window to escape. I'd probably been raped 8 or 10 times, I don't know. He was tying me to the bunk with motor pool rope. He took all my clothing from me. He would either beat me before he raped me, or he would beat me after. Eventually, Capshaw was taken to the dispensary for a test with what they called a rape kit to see if he was telling the truth. The doctors did nothing, and he was sent back to his room. I was there for another 17 months with Jeff being raped and tortured. He learned 10 years later that the rape kit and the results had simply been discarded. They threw me to the dogs, he said. Dahmer eventually was pushed out of the Army for alcohol abuse with an honorable discharge.
So not even a dishonorable discharge.
Honorably discharged.
So not even a stain on his record, able to just go into, the world with all the rights and privileges of an honorably discharged member of the American Armed Forces.
Well, it's crazy, too, because, at the time, especially then, homophobia and just like that, they don't want that to be a problem. Like, oh, there's a fucking dude raping other dudes. Yeah, that's not a problem. That didn't happen.
That never happened.
Now, once again, we have to be cautious here.
Right.
These are
Of course,
allegations. There's these guys could, that you take the cynical approach and
trying
just
to
be like,
latch
we're
on
fame
to the
whores.
sensationalism of it.
Yeah,
and
we
stuff.
happen to be in his platoon, and let's say he raped us to get media.
Yeah, I don't know how many people admit to being raped by Jeffrey. But
It doesn't
hey,
seem like something a man that was in the military would want to take.
And it was
upon
reported
himself.
at the time
Right.
too, like you said. So I mean,
And it's not like it would be tremendously out of character, but, at the same time, you can't let that, color your judgment, I suppose. You have to take everything with a grain of salt. And I mean, I think we have so far. I mean, we've learned a lot, but we really still kind of feel like we know nothing.
well, you always have to remain skeptical. I mean,
Right.
look, unless there's concrete evidence to 100% corroborate whatever someone says, or anybody about anything. I mean, look, some of the stuff it just comes down to putting faith or trust into something, and saying, hey,
Now,
look,
if that whole story about the rape kit was true, maybe we would have some evidence if the Army had actually taken it seriously. But apparently, if that
well, I'm
happened,
saying when
they
you're
did
talking
not.
about, we're talking about people's accounts. I mean, you have to say, I'm choosing to believe this part of the account. I mean, look, this guy, his dad could have made all this shit up. We don't fucking know.
Right.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, look, if we're gonna look at his life, we got to try to find the source.
That's what I'm
the most
saying.
credible.
That's ultimately what the argument has to be. It's like, look, this is probably the closest we're going to get to this person. I mean, clearly, this is pretty. You don't get much closer than this.
So it's about time for us to say goodbye to Lionel again. We'll say hello to him again at the end of this. But when Jeffrey was honorably discharged. I'm sorry, my mind immediately goes to
Yeah.
but whatever. When he was honorably discharged, Lionel didn't know about it, and I guess he kind of expected inside of himself that if something like that happened, that Jeffrey would have come home, but Jeffrey did not. He did not want to face his father's scorn or disappointment or whatever it was, and he ended up telling them his port of call was Miami. He wanted to be dropped there. He was in Germany, by the way. Not that that makes a whole lot of difference, but maybe it does. Who knows?
Who knows?
So he asked his port of call to be Miami, and they dropped him in Florida. And that's kind of where he goes off the radar, and we're left at the mercy of some, very spotty records and his own story. He worked at a sandwich shop for a while, rented motel rooms, was usually evicted for non-payment of rent, drank heavily, and frequented the bars in the area, which there's a thriving gay bar scene in Miami. There has been for the longest time. There was at this time. It is theorized, but not known, that at this time he began to perfect his methods of using barbiturates and drugs. And it's also theorized that he learned about the effects of those drugs because they were laying around the house a lot when his mom was taking them to drug men and rape them at these clubs. So if these rape allegations about him in the Army are true, I think it's safe to say that those are probably credible allegations and that he was probably skulking around these clubs, a very attractive-looking young man, a twink, as I guess they would say. Would he be a twink, TJ? I don't know.
I don't know if he looked like he does there. He looks like he's a little bit.
I mean, it wouldn't have been long after this.
A little bit too.
I guess it would have been 2 or 3 years after this. So
he's pretty well muscled and stuff. So
yeah, he's definitely in good shape, and that was something that Lionel gave to him as well. The bodybuilding element that Lionel tried to give him kind of stuck throughout his life, and he maintained a really good physique. So he was an attractive dude in these gay bars, a young guy, attractive, and I think it's safe to assume that he was probably up to some nefarious things in Miami. Although no killings, according to his testimony, and no killings that have ever been linked to him during this time. The killings don't start until his life falls out from under him yet again, and he calls on his dad yet again. And his dad, being tired, eventually has him come back and sees a little improvement, but the alcoholism comes again. Jeffrey is reclusive again. And his dad thinks it might be good for him to get out of that area. So he sends him to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother. To Wisconsin, the Milwaukee area in Wisconsin, to live with his grandmother. And that would be where Jeffrey really began to spread his wings as a serial killer and not just a one-time
That's when the
killer.
killer.
I mean, also
really got
looking
started.
at this too, it's like always seeking. I mean, at least by most accounts, his father's approval.
There was one murder done in the intervening time that was done in a. So if you scroll down, TJ, there's actually a listing of.
Stupid thing off the
Oh
screen
yeah,
here.
sorry. These
I don't know what the
websites, you know how
fuck
they are.
Shit's going on here. Get off my fucking screen.
So we've already talked about
Stephen Hicks.
Stephen Hicks. We can scroll down and see him. The next victim is unique in that he was killed in a hotel, and also unique in that Jeffrey does not remember killing him. He claims that he took this man to the hotel under similar pretenses that he used with Stephen Hicks before. Hey, dude, want to come hang out and drink? And then he claims he just woke up next to his dead body, basically.
Okay.
The man was badly beaten to death.
Yeah, it said he ripped out. It said he attempted to rip his heart out.
Well, that's something that Jeffrey theorized. He said he seems to remember something about looking at his chest and wanting to rip his heart out of his chest, but that's all he remembers.
Then there's this 14-year-old kid, Jamie.
This is when he starts using his grandmother's house as a base of operations for his nefarious deeds. Now, you'd think, having a person around, not great, but a doddering old woman is pretty easy to work around.
It's
apparently.
actually good cover too.
Oh yeah,
if you think about it.
And his first,
what's that smell?
His first victim at that house is also one of his youngest. You can read TJ there.
Jamie Doxtater, 14, killed at Dahmer's grandma's house in West Alice, I don't know.
South of
Milwaukee. January 16th, 1988.
And I believe it's Alice.
Okay. The victim was drugged, then strangled. His flesh was removed from the bones with acid, and the bones were once again pulverized. Disposal, same as Stephen Hicks.
And so now we move to our next victim. And I hate to move through them quickly, But this is the easiest information to find about Jeffrey Dahmer, and we would be remiss in not covering it.
Oh, you gotta. I mean, like now that we've delved into his psyche, let's see what that psyche actually produced. Richard Guerrero, 23, also killed at Jeffrey Dahmer's grandmother's house. Method: after having oral sex with the victim, he gave Richard a drink laced with sleeping pills, then strangled him.
So I mean, that's even when he has sex with somebody and it goes kind of like, yeah, this is good. It's like, oh, you're still gonna die.
Yeah, dismembered the corpse and disposed of the remains in the garbage. Just throw it away. Anthony Lee Sears, 26, also killed at the grandma's house in 1989. Strangled before being dismembered. Cut off his head and his genitals to keep his trophies. He then painted the skull. It says Ray, but I think that's supposed to be red.
Yes.
Same disposal method, just tossed him in the trash. Raymond Lamont Smith, 33. Also, it was killed.
So this was after. So at some point, Jeffrey reached an impasse with his grandmother, who was increasingly freaked out by shit she was finding around the house.
Right.
He was into Satanism. She was a staunch Presbyterian, and she found the Satanist Bible and some artwork and some books about bondage. And she describes one incident to Lionel about finding a mannequin, and it almost scared her to death. She was trying to put his shoes in his closet, I guess, open the closet, and this mannequin with no head, no arms, no shirt, but pants fell out at her. And he couldn't come up with a good reason for why he had that, and it freaked her out. That all came to a head eventually. She also complained of weird smells in the house that he always blamed on, there must be a rat in the wall or a dead raccoon, and he would say, I'll take care of it. And little did she know, he was just digging up some pieces of these people he was killing and
you know what it
throwing them
strikes
in
me
the trash.
as? It strikes me as these people to him were nothing more than just objects in a sense. Because once he got the value out of them, it was just now I inconveniently have to dispose of them or people will stop me from doing what I want to do. I mean, it's obviously it has to be the thought process. He wants to kill and he's doing it. So it's at a point it's just oh, well, I have to. I mean, he's smart enough to know I can't just get caught. He's not I'm going to dump the body in the street.
Right.
So there has to be some, but it's to him, that's kind of just the most inconvenient part. And the fact that he had such a fascination kind of lended, that made that easier, because most people wouldn't know how to fucking dissolve a body. No. Let's just be honest.
So at that point, he moves into 213 Oxford Apartments.
Yep, and he also gets a job at he works a bunch of odd jobs, but he works for a long time at a chocolate factory.
Right, which actually led to a Marilyn Manson song from the Manson and the Spooky Kids days called Chocolate Factory. That actually kind of parallels Jeffrey Dahmer and Willy Wonka, both seducing people into their lair with promises of rewards.
Right. I mean,
delivering.
Yeah, a good analogy for sure.
Cool song, Chocolate Factory. It's spelled Choklit.
That's some very early Manson too.
Manson and the Spooky Kids days.
Yeah.
Never got released on Interscope or any of that. But anyway, total aside. So this guy, first victim to christen the new apartment. Yay. Raymond Lamont Smith. Notice he kills a lot of black dudes. He actually lived in a black area at this time as well.
Right. He liked to hunt outside of his racial group, which is another thing that distinguished him amongst a lot of serial killers. Yep. Yeah.
Most serial killers do kill within their own racial group. Strangled the victim, then engaged in oral sex with the cadaver. He then dismembered the body and removed the head. The skull was painted gray and placed in his fridge. The bones were left in a tank of acid until all the bones were defleshed, and then he placed the bones around his apartment as ornaments. So now that he's got his own environment, he's getting real brazen.
Nobody's peeking in his closet anymore.
Right. So now it's there's not even I need to hide this. He's this is I want to be reminded of this at all times.
I mean, that's like coming to someone's house and this is me. Look, I have all this Star Wars shit. It's for him. It's look at all these bones are my victims.
Yeah,
beautiful, aren't they? And it's what?
So not even long after, that was in May. In June, not even a month later, he kills his next victim, Edward W. Smith, 27. He was enticed into Dahmer's lair, where he was drugged, strangled, and then dismembered. Typical acid dissolved.
And you can see the acceleration here. So he went 9 years, if we're to believe his story, without killing anyone.
And then he started killing a little
And then
bit. And then all this, and then at
Killed
this
a couple
point,
more
it's just going
at his
bat
grandma's
shit.
house. He dabbled in it a little more, and then he gets on his own, and it's just boom, 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 boom.
So yeah, now he's on his own at 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street. He's going nuts. So this guy, Ernest Miller, was his next victim. He was lured into Dahmer's apartment by the temptation of earning $50 to pose nude for the camera. He was then drugged and had his throat slit.
That is actually an acceleration there, because before he was strangling people, now it's like I want to cut his fucking throat.
Dahmer removed the flesh with acid, bleached the skeleton, and kept it in his wardrobe. He also kept the victim's biceps and placed them in a freezer for later consumption. David Thomas, 23. Dahmer gave him a laced drink containing sleeping pills. It doesn't say what he did to him after that.
I mean, a lot of these guys were just parts that they found all over his apartment.
Right.
In various stages of decomposition and in acid and in the freezers and, I mean, everywhere.
Curtis Straughter, 19, killed in February 18th of 1991. Drugged and strangled. Cadaver was dismembered. Bones were crushed. Skull was kept. Rest of him was dumped in the garbage. Errol Lindsay, 19. Errol was tempted into Dahmer's lair by being offered money to pose naked. He was then strangled.
So that's kind of a common thing he had with these guys. Like, give you like $100, you fucking pose. Like,
Dahmer had oral sex with the corpse before dismembering it. He then kept the skull as a trophy. He liked the skull a lot. That was an important part. Anthony Hughes, 31, killed in May of 91. He was a deaf mute, but was still tempted into Dahmer's apartment by written request, asking him to pose nude. Once inside, Dahmer drugged him and strangled him. Typical M.O. After killing him, he left his body lying around the apartment for a couple days before the process of dismemberment was engaged. The corpse was left dissolving in acid. His skull was kept. By the way, at this point, Dahmer's neighbors are complaining frequently about the smell coming from his apartment.
But it's a shitty shithole slumlord apartment.
Right,
so.
and no one does anything.
Yeah, it's like, we don't care.
No one cares.
And nobody knows can pinpoint that those smells are necessarily coming from his apartment.
Right, they just know that this
Right.
part of the apartment
It stinks.
So here's another 14-year-old he killed, Konarak Synthamosphone.
He actually attacked two people with the same last name that are not related, which is interesting.
Oh, that's interesting.
This is
anyway.
the last name you'll see again.
Konarak, yeah, of course, it'd be the hardest one. Konarak was drugged and experimented on before he was strangled. The experiments were to drill a hole in the back of the cranium and inject hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe of the brain while he was still alive. Such experiments were to create a zombie in order to be a complete control of his victim. So at this point, he's getting maybe a little tired of just fiddling around with corpses, and he wants something that's like a corpse in that it can't think.
And doesn't need anything.
But is alive.
But is still alive, and he can preserve it and have sex with it.
And suggest things to it, make
Right.
it do things. And
Right. He wants it to be his slave.
right.
But he first needs it to be mentally
a
hobbled so
total
that it can't
slave,
oppose
though.
him. Right.
Not even a slave that's like, I do this because I have no choice. Just like, I just literally cannot be anything but a mindless zombie to you.
And of
Right.
course, the way he does it is by taking a cue from his childhood with the acid that he got from his father, that he learned how to source and learned what it did, and drilling a hole into the skull and trying to burn away, I guess, the parts of the brain that deal with emotion and logic, and just leave basically a husk of a human being that he could order around.
An automaton almost.
So
yeah.
Matt Turner, 20, is the next victim, killed in June of 91. As with most other victims, he was lured into he was drugged and strangled, typical MO.
Yep.
Oh, this one's horrible, dude.
Named Jeremy Weinberger, 23. Not much unlike Konarak, except he had boiling water injected into his head and left alive in a comarized state for 2 days. He was later strangled. So another probably attempt to
Maybe a partially successful experiment in Jeffrey's eyes. He
able
was
to keep him alive for a couple days,
Right.
you know. Oliver Lacey, 23. As with most of his victims, he was drugged and strangled. During dismemberment, Dahmer would sodomize the corpse before being stored. His heart was kept in the fridge. Joseph Bradhoff, 25.
By the way,
in July of 91.
The last two killings are 4 days apart.
Right.
Just, I mean, obviously some people are just listening. These are actually only 4 days apart, these two victims.
This was July 15th to July 19th, same year.
Yep.
Joseph was lured in an apartment by being offered money to pose nude. He was then drugged and strangled. His corpse was again dismembered, but not completely. The head and torso were kept in his apartment. This is some victims that got away. There's Keeson Synthasamphone.
I did not expect that to be the double name,
That's
dude.
the same name as before.
Same name as before, but not related, you say.
And I was actually... There's a lot of meme... The movie portrays, and I was mistaken about this, the movie portrays that this kid escaped and then was actually sent back with Dahmer, who killed him. That is not the case. Dahmer was actually charged in this case with minor abuse. He wandered drunkenly and completely disoriented and wounded out of Dahmer's chamber of horrors. And once again, this happened earlier on, so this was one of his earlier experiments with his new place. Kid wandered into the streets. Some women found him, called the cops. Dahmer showed up on the scene getting back from the grocery store or whatever he was doing, and told the cops at the time that, oh, yeah, he's just my friend, he's just drunk. But the kid ended up pressing charges, and Dahmer ended up being sentenced. He spent a week in jail, was released on bail.
And then there's Tracy Edwards, 32, says he was...
And this was the guy that... This is the person that actually broke... This is the guy that's responsible for the fact that he was stopped, basically.
It says this happened on July 22nd. So once again...
I mean...
This is only 3 days, right?
3 days. I mean, it was almost to the point where he's almost getting...
Dahmer at this point is getting into a fever pitch, basically.
But obviously taking more and more chances, so it's like before, it's like these longer gaps, and it's getting shorter and shorter gaps. I mean, eventually, with probability, he's gonna make a big fucking mistake.
Mm-hmm. I mean, another thing too is since Dahmer ended up getting caught around this time, maybe these victims were just fresher, and so there were still parts of them there. Maybe there was lots of victims in between this stuff that they just never knew about or never found out about because there was nothing left of them in the house, So it could be that Dahmer was killing at that rate the whole time, and it was in a.
There's no way to know for sure.
It was in the gay community, and they were kind of on the fringe of society, so no one really did anything about it.
But I mean, we also at least can see through these confirmed victims that it was getting.
It seemed like it was
by
getting
any
more
measure,
aggressive and
it's
ramping
amping up.
Right. So Tracy was tempted into 213 by Dahmer, where he was given a cocktail to make him drowsy. Dahmer then tried to make sexual advances towards him. Tracy started to struggle when Dahmer slipped some handcuffs onto his right arm. As Dahmer went for a knife, Tracy made a run for the unlocked door. Dahmer tried to haul him back inside when a brawl started, and Dahmer was hit hard on the side of his head, knocking him onto the floor. Tracy had escaped and ran into the street where he flagged down a patrol car. The cops were then led into Dahmer's chamber of horrors where what the cops saw would linger in their minds for the rest of their lives.
Well, no shit.
Photos of various states of dismemberment, a severed head lying on the floor. The fridge had 3 bags containing a heart, flesh, and a portion of muscle. A freezer contained 3 heads, a human torso, a bag containing flesh and some internal organs. The cupboard contained various chemicals and 2 bleached skulls. On the floor, there was a large kettle holding 2 hands, a penis, and testicles. There were more than 3 skulls found in a filing cabinet. A wardrobe contained a complete skeleton, dried human scalp, and more genitals. In a box, there was 2 more skulls. Next to the box, there was a 260-liter vat containing acid. Police found 3 human torsos in various stages of decomposition.
And that's an incomplete list of obviously everything that was found in this apartment, but a good overview of the major things. It was littered with bones, pieces of bodies. It was you can find pictures of this. Obviously, we're not going to show them to you here.
No.
But you can actually find some crime scene photos from this online. I was able to find some last night, and they are grisly beyond anything you'll ever see.
It's a literal house of horrors to people.
Yep.
I mean, it's a department of horrors, I guess.
Department of horrors.
It didn't sound as good, but yeah, house of fucking horrors.
I mean, I wonder what the square footage was on this apartment, too.
I mean, he wasn't really well off, so I'm assuming it was probably.
this is probably not a large place.
Maybe a 1 or 2 bedroom place max.
So Dahmer was captured, obviously, and subsequently interviewed and copped to the 17 murders that we have just discussed. It is unknown if this is a complete list of everybody that he murdered in his life. But now we pick up at a time where he's incarcerated. And that happens to be also the time when the book that we talked about at the beginning of this was released, and the media sensation surrounding Dahmer and his the changing of him from a person into a mythological figure was already in full swing in 1993.
Right, of course.
In 1993, actually, if you go, I found an LA Times article, TJ, from that time, talking about the beginning of his trial.
January 31st, 1992, this is from.
Yep. So earlier, a little earlier. So right at the beginning of Dahmer's trial.
Dahmer believed he was Satan, defense says. Jeffrey L. Dahmer's bloody pattern of sexually motivated murder, dismemberment, and cannibalism led him to feel like he was the devil, his attorney said Thursday. Not a great defense. He became enamored, overwhelmed, caught up in the character in the horror movie.
Well, his
Exorcist
defense was
3.
insanity.
Right, okay.
Not guilty by reason of insanity, which was his plea.
The character was Satan because he was the personification of evil. He was obsessed. If you're going to be obsessed with an Exorcist movie, Jeff, be obsessed with the first one, not 3.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. I guess it's better than 2, but, anything is. Attorney Gerald Boyle said in his opening statement in Dahmer's sanity trial, Dahmer, 31, has pleaded guilty to 15 counts of murder, but not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect to the same charges. He faces mandatory life sentences on each count unless found not guilty by reason of insanity. Then he would be committed to a state mental institution,
what's crazy?
also probably for life.
Is if you remember what was going on culturally at that time, it was a big campaign against the effects of violent video games and violent television and violent movies and all and it's playing right into that. It's playing into what a lot of people want to believe. It's I was so influenced by this stuff that I felt like I was the devil. I felt like I really wasn't even myself. I couldn't even discern between fantasy and reality.
I mean, this was the defense that he went with. Obviously, any insanity defense is going to be a little more complex than a headline, but I thought the headlines from the time were interesting because Dahmer plays into something that we've talked about, we've touched on here various times, satanic panic. In fact, we did a whole show on the satanic panic.
Yes, we did.
And these tidbits about Dahmer and his infatuation with Satanism, which are true, he did have. They did find an altar that he was building out of some of the skulls, or he told them that was his plan for some of the skulls, was to eventually build a giant altar to Satan, made from them of various colors and stuff. So he definitely had an infatuation, but it came at a time where, it was still ripe for people to blame everything on devil worship.
Satan.
It's the devil.
So like I said, the media sensation surrounding Jeffrey Dahmer and what he did immediately started. In 1993, TJ, I think I pulled we'll go, skip one. I think the next one that I have here is the interview between Stone Phillips and his father.
Okay. Let's see. No, it's not that.
Oh, well, no. Go back.
Is it one of the videos?
Well, no, yeah, it's one of the videos. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Well,
Skip a video.
That's different then.
And go to The Secret Life of Jeffrey Dahmer.
So you want The Secret Life of Jeffrey Dahmer. Okay. What you're about to see is based on the true story of Jeffrey Dahmer's attacks and murders over a period of more than 14 years. Events and characters in some instances have been fictionalized and combined in order to make a story that can be shown.
Of course.
Okay, goddamn it.
You
Ain't
can
Star
skip,
Wars,
You can
motherfucker.
skip a little ahead if you want.
We're set up in another apartment.
So this is Jeff narrating.
Probably would not be able to stop. I feel it's almost a driving compulsion to commit these acts. And I have to wonder whether or not there's an evil force in the world and whether or not I've been influenced by it. No one had a clue.
This is dreadful. This is like when we were talking in the car, this is like the very worst of what I can imagine something about a serial killer to be like. Just this fucking expository, I'm evil and the evil that lives within me.
And this was the first of several movies to be made about Jeffrey's life, and it's very rare now. It was straight to video, and copies of it go for exorbitant amounts of money on eBay and shit. It is available in chunks here and there on YouTube, but I couldn't find a full copy of this film. But it looks like just basically the most dreadful, exploitative, inhumane kind of let's cash in on this. It came out in 1993. So just a scant year after these crimes were committed.
Jeffrey Dahmer, murder maniac.
Army, lived in Florida and then Ohio with my dad.
I am a dark and mysterious figure.
I hate everything.
I stalk the night, looking for victims.
I mean, it's just awful. Next on the list of movies is 2003's Dahmer. I started watching this film I guess I should say early this morning, because it was late last night, and wasn't able to get through much of it.
Right, it looks pretty bad already.
You never heard anyone before?
No.
Never?
Everyone knows his name.
But nobody knows his story.
But no one knows the man.
Ah, that was close. That dude doesn't look like Jeffrey Dahmer.
No.
Like, at all.
That is the guy that plays Hawkeye
I ain't feeling so good.
in The Avengers.
Ah.
What's in those bags?
Clippings from the garden?
Yeah, I can see it now.
Behind his smile,
Why are you following me?
Why are you so
He's
paranoid?
pure evil.
behind
So-
his side.
Just a
This
paint by the
sucks.
numbers.
I will tell you that I started watching this. I didn't finish it because it does suck, but it's not totally devoid of all good stuff. The central performance is not horrible. He's actually decent. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend watching this film. Like I said, I didn't get through it. It wasn't my taste. But it's kind of a cult film. A lot of people that are into Jeffrey Dahmer as a serial killer like this movie, I guess. I read some of the reviews. It doesn't have a totally rotten...
It doesn't look very good to
Score.
me. It kind of seems like shit, but...
I mean, some of the cinematography is cool, but I don't know. It's not a great movie. It's very slow and very exploitative, as you would expect it to be.
Yeah, I could get that just from listening to that. I mean, like, I don't want to watch a movie that contains that kind of like narration shit, where it's like he's pure evil, and then he,
It just has this vibe of like you said. It's just like the whole trailer just sells the movie as like this guy's gruesome and evil and just like up to nothing good. And it's
Which he
like-
knows, but tell us something we don't know
Yeah,
about him if
that's
you're going to
what I'm
make a
saying.
movie about him.
Everyone knows that shit. Like, come up with some kind of interesting look at his psyche or some shit instead of just like, here's the gory details.
You don't want
of
the
what
fucking
he
perfect.
done.
You don't want the perfect character, and you don't want the perfectly flawed character.
My heart is shrouded in darkness.
And this, he's a perfectly flawed
That
character.
is why I kill. Behind my smile lays pure evil.
I feel like these movies feel like the need to fill in the gaps of like what we know with this just terrible expository dialogue where it's like
like just
our
B-movie
monologue where it's
bullshit.
explaining like this is why I'm evil, this is why I'm bad. And it's like I think you need to show that. I don't think that's something you can tell because I don't think anyone really has the answer.
There's the next movie that we see is called Raising Jeffrey Dahmer. I did not watch any of this other than the trailer, so let's check it out.
Restricted.
Ooh, rated R. This is rated R. I'll give it
The
that.
preview has been restricted, so this might have some naughtiness in it.
Oh,
Is there
Lionsgate.
any way to predict whether someone will become this type of monster?
On July 22nd, 1991, Milwaukee police apprehended a serial killer and found the remains of 11 victims. The case remains one of the most shocking and horrifying mass murders by a serial killer on record.
Doesn't it have to be all at once to be a mass murder? Oh.
And ever since that day, no one has forgotten his name.
Happy Thanksgiving.
What do you need a freezer for, Jeff?
What do you need a freezer for, Jeff?
So this looks like total schlock.
Yeah, just
Jeff, what do you need a freezer for, buddy?
like not even. This is something that's not even in search of the truth. It's just like how exploitative can we possibly? How salacious? How over the? Like this is over the top.
The only other movie on the list we've already looked at, which is My Friend Dahmer, which was released very recently, 2017.
2017, last year.
And it's the only one on this list that I will recommend that you watch if you're interested in learning a little something about Jeffrey Dahmer. It's pretty good. So check that out and miss the rest of this bullshit. There are also a litany of books that have been written about Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh, shit, yeah.
With endlessly salacious titles like Inside the Mind of a Cannibal or whatever the fuck. And we could spend all night covering that shit. We spent our time covering, I think, the most relevant book written about Dahmer, which is Lionel's book. And that brings us, if you go back to that video, TJ, that was above the movies.
Okay.
Dahmer actually sat down and did an interview with then journalist. I think is he still a journalist, Stone Phillips?
I think he was in part of some scandal. I don't know. I don't think he is.
I can't
anymore.
remember. But anyway, he sat down with Stone Phillips and Lionel Dahmer to have a long discussion, which I also recommend that people watch. It's over an hour long, so we're not going to watch it here tonight, obviously. But I found an excerpt from it that I think is interesting given what we've talked about.
Stone Phillips is still active, yes.
Cool.
Okay, yes.
Anyway, witness the horror of Stone Phillips.
No, this is not it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
When I interviewed Jeffrey Dahmer in
All right.
Oh, no, sorry. This is it.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
1994, his father Lionel had just written a book as part of his own painful journey to try and understand how his son became a serial killer. Despite regular
The son
visits
become a serial killer.
to the prison.
He's got a good
father and
voice,
son
TJ. Come
had
on.
I don't know. I thought that delivery was silly.
A serial killer.
The son become a serial killer.
He had a good 90s voice, though. This is the kind of thing people wanted.
This is the kind
in
of
the
voice
90s.
that people wanted to talk in the 90s.
A small
This is
town.
what sounded
Middle
authoritative to people in the 90s.
I'm Stone Phillips.
never spoken about many of the topics covered in the book until our interview.
Oh shit.
You've read the book. Right. He called it a father's story. Pretty simple title. Right. Not a simple story, though.
No, not a simple story. Not one that was easy for me to read. But I'm glad he wrote it.
Did it hurt? Was it painful to read?
Yes, it was painful. Some parts of it were, for me, were even fun to read. There were good parts. It wasn't all negative.
Was it emotional for you reading the book?
Yes, it was.
Tell me.
Oh yeah.
Yes, it was.
It definitely seemed that way.
Yes,
I was very
it
moved
was.
by the book. It was fun at parts. I mean, like, and he's like this. I watched the whole interview last night. He's like this
That's
all
how
the
he
way
is.
through.
I mean, that's how. But
No matter what the topic is,
Yes.
that's the delivery.
What kind of feelings did you have
just
reading it?
feigning this understanding of an emotional
Deep
response.
regret.
What other emotions do I know?
Let me rifle through the other things
It just seems like
other people feel.
It feels like you're just talking to like a robot, dude. It really does. It's like the part of like where you see these facial expressions and emotion and personality. It's just kind of like, yes, I did that.
And I don't want to
That did
completely
occur.
discount him here. He might feel some version of these things. He might be tormented by the fact that his father has to deal with what he did.
I'm sure he probably was.
You know, like I don't want to paint him as somebody that was because his father, doesn't do that in his book. I don't think that happens in this interview, but it is stark to notice how very unlike a normal human interaction
even,
this is.
I mean, even if you're a psychopath, you can still think critically and rationally. I mean, rationally, he knows the situation he's in his life. He's made bad decisions. It's not like he's going to be in prison. Like, this is all really good. It turned out this way.
Sorrow. I guess those were the two main emotions.
Is there anything in this book that you strongly disagree with?
Yes, I disagree with the description of me as being so incredibly shy and introverted, because maybe that's the way my dad saw me, because there was so much tension in the home that I really didn't feel like being up and happy a lot of the times. But with my friends in school, I had a good time. We had good social life, and so I wasn't so extremely reclusive and self-centered as it portrays me.
So here is where
Paul, you had.
Go ahead.
You had a deep fascination with that answer, I think.
Yeah, because, and we covered it here tonight. That's not John Bachter's story. The My Friend Dahmer story that we covered and such, that's not the story that his friend had to tell. That's a story of a young man that was those things and that learned a way to humiliate himself and ingratiate himself to other people. That's not a good social life. So even when we're talking directly to the man, which is something we can't do for a lot of these serial killers we've talked about. We can't talk
a lot
to
of them. A lot of them die. And
so here's a chance for us to listen to his words and what he thinks about what it is, and even he can't help but try and mythologize himself. Even locked up for what he knows is going to be the rest of his life. He was sentenced to 936 years, I think, something in that zone. he's concerned that he doesn't want people to think of him as somebody that's overly shy.
Right.
Even though every indication from his family and his friends point to that being absolutely
maybe
the case.
he legitimately didn't see himself that way. Maybe when he was being the goofball spastic kid that did crazy stuff for attention and people gave it to him, maybe he legitimately thought like, yeah.
Maybe that's how he understood the social transaction of shyness. Like I act out and people look at me, so therefore I'm not introverted.
Yeah, I can't be shy then.
But, the tail of the tape is different. Alcoholism, slow but certain retraction from his friends and colleagues and
people say a lot of times perception is reality, and the perception of those around him was that he was shy. Now maybe in his mind, like you said, I mean we can only speculate, and obviously what he said here indicates that he didn't believe himself to be shy. Yeah. I mean look at the acts he did. I mean he lured people in. I think that's probably why he felt he wasn't shy. It's like, look what I've done. I mean, how can you say I'm shy if I was able to do all these things? But I mean, that could also just been you're able to subvert that part of your personality for the end. The ends justify the means.
Absolutely.
Too. It's like I really don't like interacting with people, but I want to do this. I have this compulsion, so I can override that to do what I need to do.
Right. The last thing that we're going to cover is Jeffrey Dahmer's death. I pulled a couple of things for it. Once again, it's one of those things that's really a matter of public record, and it's very easy to find information about. He was beaten to death by an inmate, not an end that you didn't see coming for him, I guess. The inmate that did it described some things that he claims led him to beat Jeffrey to death, that the veracity of which are obviously in question, largely because the man that beat Jeffrey to death had a long history of violence and mental health problems. But he claims that Jeffrey would, when they were eating in the mess hall, that Jeffrey would smear ketchup all over his food and eat it really, like caveman-like while looking around at people, as if to insinuate that he was looking around at other people and eating them. And he said that he became more and more afraid of Jeffrey as time went by, and he didn't want to be the object of one of his outbursts at mess where he would, put the ketchup and smear it all over everything. And so he finally just killed him one day. Obviously a crazy person himself. And whether or not Dahmer actually did those things behind bars is a complete unknown. The allegation is this man's and this man's alone. But that's how he ended. As far as his family goes, there's really none left. His brother, Mike, his younger brother, who was in a picture that we saw earlier, the picture where he went to the military there, has changed his name and now lives in total anonymity.
I can't hardly blame him.
Dropped the Dahmer label on.
And an interesting little happenstance connection. His mother, when she left, ended up going to Fresno, California, where I'm my old stomping grounds, and lived there her entire life. Was a big AIDS advocate there and worked at an AIDS treatment facility there for a long time. She died in 2000. I don't know. You know what? I don't know why I didn't look, but I don't know if Lionel is still
actually
alive.
tried to find that out, and I couldn't find any.
So Lionel's off the map.
I couldn't find any report that he died, but I couldn't find anything that said he was still alive.
I mean, his book has been all but buried, so I don't see why they shouldn't just treat his life
He
the
would
same.
Obviously be very old at this point if he is alive.
You can see he was at an advanced age during the Stone Phillips interview, so a good chance that he's probably not with us, but if he is, very advanced age. There's nobody really around to talk about how Jeffrey was, other than John Backdurf, who's kind of said, I think, what he wants to say about his time with Dahmer. So that's basically where this ends tonight, I guess. Once again, as always proves the case with our biographical episodes, it took a shape that I didn't expect it to. I hope people enjoyed it. I did. I enjoyed learning about it.
Here's the funny thing. You've been calling him John Backdurf the whole time?
I thought that was his name.
Apparently his name is literally Durf Backdurf.
Well, no, that was his nickname, and they called him Durf because his last name was Durf.
I see.
Oh, I see.
But his first name is John.
I guess he still goes by Durf, though.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to call him Durf all night and have, you know what I mean?
People be like, what?
His real first name is John.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, his nickname, because of his very strange last name, was always Durf. And so he goes by Durf Back Durf now.
I like it.
I mean, I think the fascinating thing is with a lot of serial killers, and perhaps all of them, but maybe not necessarily all, is that we always just kind of, like you said, we come back to the question of why someone would do this, the compulsions people have. I mean, I think it kind of makes you wonder what path his life could have taken, or your own, where it's like you give into this part of your personality and you become like this. And I mean, I don't think there's any easy answers. And like, it seems like everyone in his life kind of asked that question after. I mean, he had a profound impact on people in the sense
One thing that struck me,
he made them question their own humanity.
Yeah. One thing that struck me and Paul after we both read the graphic novel was, there's nothing really in the graphic novel that casts any real sort of judgment on Jeffrey Dahmer. But then in the there's like an outro text or whatever, then it's like he's a monster and he's evil and blah 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 blah, like almost like he felt a need to apologize for what he'd written, for it not being like that.
Right.
He had to make sure,
trying to head off at the pass the hordes of angry people that are going to be hyper offended for the victims.
Right. Within the art he created, there's none of that judgment. But then he made sure on the last page to be like, "Well, no, he's a bad person."
Jeffrey Dahmer's already been judged.
Right.
He's already been judged.
Like
in a court of law, in a court of public
opinion.
opinion.
You don't need to pat yourself on the back for being able to say Jeffrey Dahmer's a monster or some shit. It's easy.
And there's a difference between empathizing with the victims and the families of the victims and trying to paint a man as a monster.
Right.
He wasn't a monster. I hate it when people refer, and I understand there's a metaphor behind it.
Of course.
It's the old Grendel thing. You know what I mean? It's a monster.
Right.
That's reductive. This is a human being
that
was raised in a household that rang bells in my life, learning about it.
Yeah.
Constant fighting, constant argument, constant disharmony. It's a human being. And if we want to understand what he did, calling him a monster and talking about how horrible and evil everything was doesn't do any service to those victims.
No.
It doesn't ennoble their deaths any.
Doesn't do us any service either.
And it doesn't do us any service in understanding how people like this happen.
But you want to see something fucked up?
What?
What was the name of one of his victims, Scotty?
Stephen Hicks.
You got one. Can you name another one?
There was... Nah, dude, that's it.
If you walked up to a random person on the street and asked him who's Jeffrey Dahmer, I feel like a lot of people would know. If you asked him to name one victim, probably couldn't do it.
Not a single one. That's how you ennoble the victims.
And
by
we just learned
talking
about it.
them. And learning about how they died and why they died and what was in the mind of the man that killed them.
You did a ton of research.
But it's like,
how many can you name?
We'd never do...
A couple, maybe. John Synthosomophone and
Yeah.
Keith or Ken Synthosomophone, I think. But yeah, I'm in the same boat. I don't have many.
But it's like we would never do a show on any one victim of a serial killer.
No.
But on the serial killer themselves, we'll do it.
Because to be a victim is something entirely different.
And it's not as fascinating to people.
Well, it's like think about this. People, I mean, yeah, there might be a documentary made about gazelles, but most people want to see the documentary about the lion eating the gazelle.
So what does that
And
say?
there's a reason for
that. To me, that says something about why people do stuff like this. Because none of us identify with any victim of a crime, but you can always kind of see some darker reflection of some part of yourself in a killer or a monster or a dictator or any sort of fucking thing like that.
Or imagine yourself in that role.
And that's, to me, why people have to put on this airs of like, oh my God, I'm so outraged, monster, monster, bad, bad, because they want to deny that part of themselves.
Yeah.
But it's there.
You're not going to understand
And the fascination with serial killers springs from it.
He wasn't a monster, dude. He was born of a human womb just like everybody else. And if you're going to understand him, you should treat him that way. And I tried to do that tonight with my research, and I hope that I accomplished at least a piece of it.
And even more important, understand the darkness within yourself and what actually separates you from someone like that.
Right. Thanks for being patrons.
Thank you.